Characteristic was their beard, which they had from the beginning of their lives, male and female alike, and it is said that they could die of shame if they were subjected to shaving. They had a tendency toward gold lust and committed their share of rash and greedy acts. Among these was the dispute over the Nauglamir, which led to the slaying of Ilu Thingol and stirred up the initial suspicion between elves and dwarves to open hatred. Dwarves generally lived far from the sea and avoided getting on boats, as they disliked the sound of the ocean and were afraid of it. Ola created the dwarves to be strong, resistant to fire and the evils of Morgoth. They were hardier than any other race, secretive, stubborn and steadfast in enmity or loyalty. The dwarves are described as the most redoubtable warriors of all the speaking peoples, a warlike race who would fight fiercely against whoever aggrieved them, including dwarves of other mansions and lordships. Highly skilled in the making of weapons and armour, their main weapon is the battle axe, but they also use bows, swords, shields and mattocks. They are resistant to fire more than elves or men. Sickness was almost unknown to the dwarves, as they were immune to human diseases. They were generally less corruptible than men. When Sauron attempted to enslave the free folk of Middle-earth using the Rings of Power, the elves completely resisted his power. Indeed, his hand had never sullied the 3 rings, while the 9 rings utterly corrupted the men who bore them into the ringwraiths. In contrast, the dwarves were sturdy and resistant enough that Sauron was not able to dominate them using the 7 rings. At most, the 7 rings sowed strife among the dwarves and filled their wearers with an insatiable greed for gold. But they did not turn them into wraiths subservient to the Dark Lord, and he considered his plan to have failed. Sauron was furious at the dwarves' resistance, spurring his drive to recapture the 7 rings from them. Another example was Gimli, who, while Saruman used the power in his voice and the Rohirrim were spellbound by his magic, Gimli was unmoved and commented that Saruman's words cannot be trusted, causing Saruman to be angered enough to lose his charm. The lifespan of dwarves was varied depending on their breed. The Longbeards were particularly long-lived, but by the 3rd age their lifespan was diminished and they lived on average 250 years. The kings of Durin's folk named Durin were particularly long-lived. Occasionally they would live up to 300 years of age, and Dwalin reached the rare lifespan of 340 years, comparable to a middleman living to 100. Until they were around 30 years of age, dwarves were considered too young for heavy labour or war. Hence the slaying of Azog by Dane Ironfoot at age 32 was a great feat. By the age of 40, dwarves were hardened into the appearance that they would keep for most of their lives. Between the approximate ages of 40 and 240, most dwarves were equally hale and able to work and fight with vigour. They took on the appearance of age only about 10 years before their death, wrinkling and greying rapidly, but never going bald. Although dwarves did not suffer from diseases, corpulence could affect them. In prosperous circumstances, many grew fat by the age of 200 and became physically inept. Earthbread was a root well known to dwarves, but almost unknown to elves or men. Coffee was at least known to hobbits and dwarves. The dwarves didn't have relationships with animals, didn't harbour even dogs, and wouldn't mount a horse willingly. For this reason, they found the Northmen useful trade allies in the Second Age. In earlier times, whenever the dwarves were unable to barter for grain, they practiced agriculture using a plough-like tool that they invented. However, dwarves did not enjoy doing such labour. The dwarves' numbers, although they sometimes flourished, often faced periods of decline, especially in periods of war. The slow increase of their population was due to the rarity of dwarf women, who made up only about 1/3 of the total population. Dwarves seldom wedded before the age of 90 or more, and rarely had so many as 4 children. They took only one husband or wife in their lifetime and were jealous, as in all matters of their rights. The number of dwarf men that married was actually less than half, for not all the dwarf women took husbands. Some desired none, and some wanted one they couldn't have and would have no other. Many dwarf men did not desire marriage because they were absorbed in their work. Dwarf women seldom walked abroad, and that only in great need. When they did travel, they were so alike dwarf men in voice, appearance and garb that it was hard for other races to tell them apart. They were likewise seldom named in genealogies, joining their husbands' families. The only dwarf woman named in Tolkien's legendarium is Dis, sister of Thorin Oakenshield, who was given a place in the records because of the gallant deaths of her sons, Fili and Kili. The scarcity of women, their rare mention and their identical looks with the males, coupled with the dwarves' secretive culture, led many to mistakenly believe that dwarves were born out of stone, and upon death they returned to that stone. Dwarves are fiercely devoted to their parents and children. In their desire for their children to grow up hardy and enduring, they may treat them harshly, but they will protect them at all costs. Dwarves resent injuries to their children and to their parents more than injuries to themselves. The dwarves loved and revered the Vala Aula. Of old, the elves believed that the dwarves would have no future in Arda unmarred, but the dwarves themselves held to a promise that Ilúvatar would hallow them and adopt them as his children. They maintained that after death, Aula, Mahal, cared for them, gathering them to the halls of Mandos with the other children of Ilúvatar, though in halls set apart. It is said that after the last battle they will work alongside Aula in the remaking of Arda. The dwarven language was created by Aula and was called Kuzdul. It was a strange language to elves and men, and few non-dwarves learned it because it was difficult, and the dwarves kept it secret, preferring to communicate in the languages of their neighbours. Only one Kuzdul phrase was well known to outsiders, the ancient battle cry, going back to at least the First Age, Baruch Kazad, Kazad I Menu, which means axes of the dwarves are upon you. The dwarves taught Kuzdul carefully to their children as a learned language, not a cradle tongue, and thus the language changed very little over the ages, unlike those of other races. The dwarves also devised a secret language of gestures to communicate between themselves in silence, the Iglishmek. Certainly in the First Age, when they first made contact with the elves, the only tongue in Beleriand would have been Sindarin at that time, as the Noldor had not yet returned from Aman. As a logical consequence, therefore, Sindarin was a language used by the dwarves. But the dwarves were swift to learn, and indeed were more willing to learn the elven tongue than to teach their own to those of alien race. In fact, the dwarves were so impressed by the elvish runes, the Surth of Daeron, for writing Sindarin, that they adopted them for use in their own tongue and used them forevermore. Dwarves had a great interest in languages since their first contact with other peoples, and had a good ability to pronounce foreign sounds from other languages. However, they could not conceal their voices, which were deep in tone, with laryngeal coloration. So among themselves they could even speak with a laryngeal whisper. As creations of Aula, they were attracted to the substances of Arda and crafts. They mined and worked precious metals throughout the mountains of Middle-earth. They were considered unrivaled in arts such as smithing, crafting, metalworking and masonry, even by the Noldor. The dwarves were the greatest miners ever to exist in Middle-earth, building immense halls under mountains where they built their cities. They built many famed halls, including Menegroth, the fairest dwelling of any king that has been east of the sea, Nargothrond, Khazad Dûm, the grandest mansions of the dwarves, the Elven King's halls, and the kingdom under the mountain. In the darkness of Arda already the dwarves wrought great works, for even from the first days of their fathers they had marvellous skill with metals and with stone. But in that ancient time iron and copper they loved to work, rather than silver and gold. In the tempering of steel alone of all crafts, the dwarves were never outmatched even by the Noldor, and in the making of mail of linked rings, which was first contrived by the smiths of Belegost, their work had no rival. During the Third Age of the captivity of Melkor, the dwarves smithied for Thingol, for they were greatly skilled in such work, though none among them surpassed the craftsmen of Nogrod, of whom Telkar the smith was greatest in renown. They were also capable masons and smiths. Dwarven smithing skills were said to be unrivaled, and their masonry creations were bested by none. The crafting skills of the dwarves were unmatched. They crafted objects of great beauty out of gems and metals. They crafted many famed weapons, armours and items of art and beauty, among them Narsil, the sword of Elendil, the dragon helm of Dor-Lomin and the necklace Nauglamir, the most prized treasure in Nargothrond and the most famed dwarven work of the elder days. In the Third Age, dwarves wrought with patient craft works of metal and stone that now none can rival. However, as stated by Gloin at the Council of Elrond, the dwarves of Erebor have surpassed their predecessors in mining and building before Smaug descended on the lonely mountain, but not in metalwork, smithing or the making of mail, as their predecessors' secrets have been long lost.